Hi. Hi, welcome to Art169, the composition lecture. So we've been kind of talking about composition leading up to this. We talked about Gestalt theory. We kind of talked about lines, the emphasis of getting as many eyes on your work, getting the eyes on motion, sort of keeping eyes moving instead of just kind of focusing down the center. So we've been talking around it, but today we're actually talking about composition, which is very important because it is really the building blocks of how you arrange your work. So it's a combination of multiple parts in a harmonious whole, the arrangement of visual elements within the frame, how objects, shapes, etc. are placed within the frame. There is a focal element structure and balance. So you have all these things that you want to put in your assignment, or all these things your client needs in their logo, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to arrange it to have it look good. Um, as designers, we build within our composition, and as photographers, you edit away from your composition. So this works a little differently in photography and within design. So we're focusing on building things within the frame. My dog is crying. He wants to hang out with us. So the first thing we're talking about is focal point, and it's what the eye is drawn to, the emphasis of the image. Focal problems a lot of time are no focal point, so there's too many things to look at. You get viewer engaged within the work. Now, sometimes our eyes can be drawn to different parts, which is fine. But sometimes it's nice to have multiple focal points because you can think about how those elements arrange with each other. If there's too much, we don't know where to land and we're just like, feel like our eyes are assaulted and we can't handle it. If there's no focal point, then what's the point? Why am I looking at this? I'm bored. Let's move on. So this photograph here has like no focal point. I don't know where I'm supposed to look. Part of me thinks maybe the tree branch or the tree, but like it's too far away. Like I don't know where to look. So this is a problem of no focal point. This could be a nice exposed image. It could have nice color. It's still not good because I don't know what I'm supposed to look at. There's some depth of field and shallow, but there's just like the leaves. There's not one leaf drawing my attention. This is an example of bad composition with no focal point. So how do we gauge our focal point? So we think about our natural focal elements. They're usually high contrast. So anything that's pulling out from anything else. Saturation, that's more saturated where the camera is focused. So if you're a photographer, think about your depth of field. Your motion, so if there's motion, usually we're drawn to it. Our eyes will kind of go on what's moving versus what's not moving. Faces or figures, people are drawn to faces and figures. I know personally, if I see a face or a figure in a photograph or a drawing, my eye will immediately go there. That's not true for everybody, but it is true for a lot of people. So how to influence or guide your viewer to your focal element, because everyone's going to look and find a different thing to focus on sometimes. Like in this picture, I may focus on the red apple, but someone may focus on this one because there's a nice highlight and then the stem is very short. So using guiding lines, framing, and geometry is a good way to emphasize your focal point. So this image has a circular composition, so we're using this as an example of how to gauge focal point. So we have this motion of this train coming out, and we have these circular lines coming in, leading us into the train. The artist has said, this is my focal point and I want to guide my viewer there. However, with these lines, it keeps us moving. Our eyes are going to follow a line. So the focal point might be something different for other people. It might be these shadows, it might be this, or it might be the person in the back. However, the photographer is using lines to lead us all the way in, contrast to kind of keep our eyes figure out what is the focal point and shape. So this is something that's different. It's contrasting because it's big, big shadow. So our eye might be drawn to that. All right, so this has two focal points, maybe even three. So you have the woman here, the house, and then this third house. So it's a nice triangle. And people like triangles, so we're using geometry to put our focal point interest there. There's a line here, and it's also in the rule of thirds. Sorry to draw a little box, we'll talk about it in a second. Contrast, what's pulling away from the scene, using all of these focal guidelines. Abstraction, so it's easier when it's things of reality, but abstraction is a little different. There's a couple of different things you might be focused on here, maybe this line, maybe over here, but using contrast pulls you in. Even the blue will pull your eye as well, and then using the moments to kind of keep your eye moving as well. It's a little difficult, but my eye is drawn to this circle. Think about where your eye went first. Did it kind of bounce around? Are you led through different focal points? Is shape in contrast leading you in? Now this one's a bit much. So typically we're going to focus on the center, but since there's too many different things to look at, I don't know where my eye can focus because there's so much contrast, so much going on, so many lines, so many shapes. It's a little difficult for me to move anywhere else. I'm kind of stuck there. So this is an example of too many focal points. Maybe simplify a little. So structure, this is the other part of composition. So it's the elements like line, shape, and position, placement of objects for emphasis. There's non-structure, texture, light, perspective. So the structure. So we're going to talk a little about the zones. We talked about it in a second. You may be familiar with this, especially if you're a photography student. It's zones in the rule of thirds, and then there's the golden section. So the rule of thirds is, again, what used most often in photography, but it's how we divide things, and it's how things naturally occur in a division of the scene. So instead of putting something straight in the center, and your eye kind of gets stuck there and you don't move around, you put something in one of these cross sections, and even in the golden section, which is a little bit more narrow. This is kind of a stronger composition. It uses things like balance and sort of positive and negative space. So we have these two photos, images. A is the same scene in the center, and the one B is within the rule of thirds. Which one is visually more interesting? You're probably going to say B, because it's placed in that section. Also, we literally just talked about the rule of thirds. So it's kind of leading out, think about what's going on over here. This, you're kind of stuck there and your eye won't move around. However, if you place things here, we really like things in that corner. So think about how people read an image or read a book or a page. We here in the West read left to right, up and down. So it's kind of like an F shape. And that's kind of what we follow along with our eyes, and that's how our eyes will move and scan a photograph. So you may put cross like an accent to help you kind of lead in. You don't want to put something there, the thing right there. This is borrowing from the golden mean. So finding a focal point. So this is a little different. I've read a few different things. This says your eyes are going to look there, then up and down. But I read stuff where it goes there, so it's a little debated. Which composition do you like best? left or right. So just because you're using the rule of thirds doesn't mean you can't put something in the center. So we have this section where it, using perspective, 1 point perspective goes into the center, but the top is 1/3, bottom is 2/3. Even think about the space where everything is occurring. Again, you're cutting something off, which just has a nice sort of lead in, because then you have this nice negative space here. So the golden ratio, so it's 1 to 1.618. Again, you may have heard the Fibonacci sequence, or the Fibonacci spiral. You may remember this in maths, or the Da Vinci Code was heavily based on this. The golden ratio is sort of this perfectly symmetrical relationship between two proportions. So if anything in that top square, you can repeat the sequence indefinitely. So this halves into this, halves into this, and you can just keep going and going, and it will always kind of be this sort of golden ratio. And if you take away the large square, it will still be a golden ratio. So why do we care, or why does this matter? So this sort of naturally appeals to the human eye. It's sort of this sort of naturally occurrence sequence of these like golden ratios. And there isn't quite a reason why we like it, but I think it's just pleasing. And because it relates so much to nature, we as humans, when we see something within the golden ratio, it fits, it makes sense to us. So you may put something in the rule of thirds, but you maybe use the golden ratio for inspiration. So there's different golden proportions. So there's the golden section. So it's kind of like the rule of thirds, but a little bit more narrow. There's the spiral section. There's the actual physical spiral. There's harmonious triangles, and then golden triangles, which are kind of flipped. So Da Vinci did a lot of paintings within the golden ratio, which made it a strong composition. Makes it how you're dividing something up. It occurs a lot in nature. And then it was used to help design the iPhone or the iPod. Remember those things? Different types of compositions usually lead us into balance. So balance is the equal relationship between two or more things. The composition and balance is when various elements weigh the same. So we want something to be in balance. Doesn't mean they must take up the same room. Balancing composition involves both positive and negative space, sizing, contrast, and how everything fits together. So visual weight is influenced by position, so where things are placed within the frame, size. The larger will feel heavier. Texture, so anything more complex will be heavier, simple will be less heavy. Isolation, value contrast, quantity, orientation, shape, and color. So the top is an equal balance. And the bottom is asymmetrical. It's unbalanced. And the bottom one is balanced based on where everything is placed within the frame, but it's asymmetrical balance. So symmetrical or formal balance is bilateral. So think of things on a vertical axis. The left side is about weighs the same as the right side. It's formal, ordered, stable, and quiet. It can be boring. People, it's expected. A lot of time used in architecture. Now, asymmetrical and informal balance, it's different. It's how there's different visual weights. The weight's equal, but the elements are not identical. This has got the nice little texture to it. Kind of breaks things a little off. For example, it's a way to think about how you design and order rooms. It's used in so many different ways. The top one is symmetrical, bilateral. Bottom one is asymmetrical. So there's different shapes, different colors, but they have the same visual balance. So there's radial and mosaic balance. Radial is where elements radiate from a common center. So rays of sunlight, ripples. So this is sort of the balance where things kind of balance kind of throughout. And this may be really sort of emphasized in set 5. Mosaic is sort of results from balanced chaos. So think of Jackson Pollock. There's lacks distinct focal points, but the elements share a uniform emphasis. The lack of hierarchy leads to visual noise at a first glance, but somehow it all works together. This is a lot more, it's more abstract, it's more difficult to achieve a strong mosaic balance. Dynamics is about visual movement, sort of what you give emphasis to. And there's visual tension, so which is nice to have. So the stress of something on the edge, it holds our attention. It's sort of this like unbalancedness that people really like. You can repeat that. And this is an image breaking visual tension. So I want you to sort of think about composition, how you arrange things out. Think about balance, think about order, think about using the rule of thirds or even the golden spiral. It's going to be difficult to sort of get into a strong balance at first, but think about how you're placing your things in the frame and stepping away from trying to using the thing in the center with nothing around it. That's boring, it's basic, it's easy. How we can push and add some texture and variety to it. So have fun, think about composition. There is a PDF reading which should be interesting to read as backup information.